So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Today is a very special seminar for me because I'm really happy to introduce Aurora Torres, who's a good friend of mine and also one of the best researchers I had the chance to collaborate with. She did her PhD in Madrid, in the Museo, and at the time she was a road ecologist. Then she went to Leipzig, to IDIV, where we met, and she has, for the past 6 years, been spearheading research in sand sustainability, and that's what she's going to talk about today. So, Aurora, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thank you for coming. So today I'm here to talk about a sustainability frontier you may have never heard of, sand. So in the last year, we have seen how this natural resource has gained increasingly space in the media. We have heard about the global sand crisis, the sand wars, the sand mafias, Singapore stealing sand from Indonesia and being accused of the disappearance of 24 islands. And it's not by chance or because it's a trendy topic, it's a reflection of to what extent our relationship with this natural resource has changed in the last decades, and this is creating sustainability challenges. So today in my presentation, I would like to put some light into this messy business of the sand industry. So I will take you first to a journey and the transition that I have done from the field of road ecology to sand sustainability. Then I will present you some global challenges that are connected with the growing extraction and consumption of sand resources. And towards the end, we will discuss some transition pathways that are emerging and ways to promote a more sustainable use of this resource. And my research, as Leticia was saying, has evolved a lot during this year, but what is really central to all my research is the aim to advancing our understanding of the direct and indirect impacts of infrastructure and urban development on human environmental systems. So for me, it all started with this species, with the abutarda. I did my PhD in ecology in el Museo Nacional de Ciencias Naturales. And during my PhD, I was focusing more on the direct impacts. I was assessing the impacts of intensive human land uses like urban sprawl and infrastructure development on wildlife and landscapes. But 6 months before defending my PhD, something happened that piqued my curiosity. By then, I was attending a conference in Portland. It was a conference of the International Association of Landscape Ecology, and I was presenting the results of a couple of chapters of my dissertation. And in that time, in a very informal and random conversation, I heard for the first time about sand and an entire beach, a sandy beach in Jamaica, being stolen, because apparently this resource was becoming really strategic in Jamaica, and resorts were fighting against this resource and stealing each other sandy beaches. So at that point, I started thinking, well, to what extent we have entered the Anthropocene that now a resource like sand is becoming strategic and critical. And also I realized that when I was assessing the impacts of infrastructure development, I was only looking at a part of the picture, at the direct impacts on site, but what about the construction minerals that we need for infrastructure development? So in that moment, I started to create a working group of colleagues to investigate this topic. But when I finished my PhD, it was a bit too early to transition to this field of research. So I moved to Germany, where I met Leticia, and I was for 2.5 years working in a project at the Science Policy Interface to promote the ecological restoration agenda with a perspective of rewilding. I know Leticia has told you a lot about rewilding, so I will not enter on that. But during this time, I also kept doing some parallel research on sand. And by the end of my contract, I got a Marie Curie fellowship, a global fellowship, in which I spent 2 years in Michigan State University and 1 last year in the Université Catholique of Louvain, where I just finished last year. And it was to develop a project called Sand Leaks that allowed me to fully focus in this field of research and that looks at the integration and the testing of these relationships between the use of sand, environmental pressures, and socioeconomic outcomes. But why did I become so passionate about this resource and why I think you should care about sand resources? you may have heard that in the last 2 years, the anthropogenic mass of the planet has outweighed all of Earth's living biomass. But maybe what you don't know is that 90% of that is sand, gravel, and crushed rock that we use for infilling or for the foundation of our houses, and also to produce concrete and asphalt. And most of the extraction of these resources has happened in the last 30 years, to the point that these materials have now become the world's most extracted solid materials by mass, beyond fossil fuels and biomass. And their extraction is expected to continue and to double in the next decades with urban growth, population growth, infrastructure development, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and changing lifestyles, as we will see later. And this is creating significant challenges at the global scale. This is the first article that we published on this topic that was published in Science in 2017. And it was the first article in a scientific journal that was kind of connecting the dots across disciplines and providing a holistic perspective of the challenges that are associated with a growing extraction and use of sand resources and biodiversity loss, water and food security, or health impacts. And at the same time, we published an article in The Conversation, and we, for the first time, used the term global sand crisis, not so much referring to a crisis of scarcity, as we will see later, but referring to what extent the dramatic consumption of these resources has changed, and this is associated with different problems. And this was quite welcomed by the media and was even shared by President Joe Biden. In that moment, he was the ex-vice president. And when we talk about these sustainability challenges or this crisis, we refer to 3 different dimensions. The first one is ensuring the supply of materials for satisfying societal needs for housing, transportation, industry. And here the question that the journalists are always making is, are we running out of sun? When are we going to reach the peak of sun, as we have done with other resources? And the response is very simple. We just don't know, because there is no global assessment that has been conducted on the geological stocks that are available under uncertainties. So we simply don't know. But geologically speaking, as you might imagine, sand and gravel are resources that are quite widely distributed in the planet in different forms and qualities. And it's not only that we can extract sand and gravel from unconsolidated deposit, we can also produce it by crushing rocks, and there is a large variety of rocks like granite or basalt, limestone, that can be used for this purpose, and we can even use secondary materials. So considering all of these together, it seems unlikely that at the global scale we are running out of sand. However, we are seeing more and more problems at local and regional scales, particularly in locations where the demand is very concentrated and it has grown very fast. But here it's also important that you distinguish between the physical scarcity and the economic scarcity. So the physical scarcity is when there is an unfavorable geology or an overexploitation of available deposits. But quite often what happens is an economic scarcity. So resources are physically available, but there are socioeconomic and socio-environmental constraints that limit the access to those deposits. It can happen because of urban growth occurring on top of valuable deposits, such as the City of London. And it can happen because of competing land uses like food production or nature protection. And another one of the big of the challenges is the environmental impacts that are associated with extraction of these materials. So mining and construction, through this activity, every year we move around 24 times the amount of sediment that is naturally delivered by the rivers to the ocean. So because of that, these activities are now considered the most significant geomorphological shaping force in the 21st century, and this is one of the indicators that has been proposed for saying that we have entered the Anthropocene. And the impacts are quite visible, but quite often it's not. The direct impacts can be relatively limited and concentrated, but the indirect impact can be more intense, for example, via erosion and land instability. This is, for example, the Poyang Lake in China and the before and after of the mining activity, and that you can see that is pretty intense. This is a very large area that is affected. Now, despite these numbers, we know relatively little about the burden of this activity for human and environmental systems, and such as biodiversity. Why is that? First of all, because there is a diversity of sources from where we can extract aggregates. We can dredge rivers and coastal areas, we can excavate deposits in floodplains, and we can produce this material by crushing rocks in quarries with different impacts to different ecosystems. There is also a lack of global maps of mining sites. You may have seen some publication on global maps of mining sites. They don't include construction minerals, even though by far this is the biggest mining endeavor, and there are already thousands of operations in just the US or China. And partially connected to that is the fact that the industry is strongly dominated by small and medium-sized companies. And then there are many reporting challenges, and there is also a very large share of informality in many countries that can go to from 25 to 90% of the total market. So all this makes quantifying this threat quite a daunting challenge. So we have tried to move in this direction to start addressing this gap by conducting the first systematic evaluation of species that are threatened by this activity globally. So we have asked two very simple questions. How many species exist that have been reported to be threatened by this activity, in general by the mining of construction minerals, and where are higher levels of threat reported, and which type of species are the ones that seem more affected? For this, we have combined two different data sources, the IUCN Red List and new descriptions of species. And what we have found is that there are already over 1,000 species in the Red List for which mining of construction minerals have been described as a threat to the species, over 600 of them in threat category. And what is really interesting is that we see that through time there is an increasing saliency of this threat. The reporting of this threat seems to be increasing, but when we look at the data of the IUCN Red List, and when we look at the descriptions of new species, that just in the moment of description, the authors specify that they are imminently threatened by mining activity. And when we look at the range of these species that are affected, we see that they are mainly distributed in a belt from Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Northern Africa to Western Europe. And the data of the new species description to some extent allow us to expand this coverage of threats to other biodiversity hotspots, such as in Brazil or in South Africa. And to get an idea of the profile of the species that are affected by this activity or that have been reported to be affected, we conducted associations, habitat and threats association, and we found that being reported as threatened was strongly related with habitats of coastal areas, freshwater systems, and rocky habitats. And also with being threatened by other threats such as road and urban areas development, which is directly connected to the mining activity, but also pollution and natural system modifications such as the construction of dams. And it's interesting to look at different types of mining. In particular, we have tried to separate the excavation of sand and gravel deposits from the rock quarrying of different types of rocks. And we see that there is a substantial separation by taxonomic groups and habitats of the affected species, with the ones that are affected by the excavation of sand and gravel belonging more to freshwater and coastal habitats, and with the species affected by quarrying, mainly limestone quarrying, being more distributed in rocky habitat, caves, and forest. And one interesting element that also allows us to understand our data set a bit more is that the range of these species affected by rock quarrying is significantly smaller than the range of the species affected by sand and gravel extraction. Mainly because we have many species affected by limestone quarrying that have very, very small ranges, that they only are present in 1 or 2 limestone hills. and then this activity is a significant threat to their survival. However, this number of 1,000 species threatened is probably just the tip of the iceberg, starting from the fact that the IUCN Red List only assesses the status, or has assessed the status and the threats of less than 80% of the species that are known to exist. So doing some extrapolations, we consider that this number will be more closer to an order of magnitude of 25,000 species. And in the next year, we are going to move in the direction of trying to mobilize data to get more information on potential species impacted. And before moving into the social impacts, there is one more environmental impact that I want to highlight, that is climate change. Because you might think that the extraction of sand and gravel has a relatively little carbon footprint, and technically speaking, that is correct. But the extraction of aggregates is also coupled with the production of cement and steel that have a very high carbon footprint. And then we have the emissions of what we build with these materials, that particularly if they are very inefficient, they will produce significant locking effects and will keep the system into an unfavorable state. And at the same time, the increase in CO2 emissions and climate change is expected to increase the extraction of these materials, because the increase in temperatures and CO2 emissions accelerate the degradation of concrete and asphalt, and then we will need more materials. And on the other hand, we will need a massive amount of materials for adaptation and mitigation to climate change. So this is a significant threat that we also have to consider. And then the final component of these sustainability problems is the social dimension. This is probably the most complicated, because on one hand you have the benefits that the mining industry generates, and this is a very important livelihood diversification activity in small and medium income countries. So that's very important to consider. But at the same time, the environmental degradation caused by the extraction of these materials can affect the provisioning of ecosystem services for human communities. One of the best studied implications is the increased vulnerability to natural hazards such as storm or even tsunamis. The Indian Ocean tsunami had significantly more effects, for example, in areas like Sri Lanka, because of the extensive mining of sand that was going on before the tsunami in the coast. And there are many issues with erosion in places like the Mekong Delta, where there are many environmental refugees. And then we have problems with water and food security, because the extraction can decline the water table and limit the access to drinkable water, or force people to walk for longer distances to get water. And it can also affect the productivity of wild and cultivated food sources. Then we also have impacts on health. I'm sure most of you have heard about the impacts of dust. That's very well known. But there is also an increasing amount of studies showing a higher prevalence of diseases like malaria or the Buruli ulcer in places where there is sand mining going on, mainly because of these standing water pools that are created and are perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes transmitting the malaria. And finally, we have the social conflicts. And here what happened is that the high revenues generated by this activity, in particular when the demand increases very fast, create the perfect conditions for illicit supply networks to emerge. And for example, in India, the sand mafias is one of the more powerful crime organizations, and they have killed hundreds of people in recent years in sand wars. And this might seem very far from us, like it's not really affecting us in Spain, but we also have our own conflicts. And for example, the Canary Islands is one of those a bit of sensitive spots where we have issues with the illegal extraction of sand and also with the imports of sand from Western Sahara. So with all this complexity, how do we tackle the challenge of promoting sand sustainability? Well, we consider that balancing these protection efforts with the supply of materials require designing sustainable pathways at a system level. So Specifically, this requires shifting the focus from just the mining site to the entire sand supply network of a region as a coupled human and natural system, a system that exists just to supply the materials for building the stocks that satisfy societal needs. And this framework is informed by theories of socioeconomic metabolism, telecoupling, and complex adaptive systems. So what do we mean by these sand supply networks? Well, we consider first that a more sustainable use of sand resources hinges on a good understanding of the physical system of construction aggregates, construction sand and gravel. That is kind of the backbone of the system, and that requires quantifying the stocks and flows of materials of a region over time and space. Just to give you an idea, this is how a general material flow analysis system for construction sand look like. And what is really interesting about these systems and these representations is that they allow us to see the sequence of activities that transform and process the material from the geological stock to the anthropogenic stock, this anthropogenic mass that I was saying at the beginning. And it's interesting that they also allow us to see the importance of identifying alternative sources and the relationships between different sources and process along the cycle of materials. So for example, we know that we can excavate sand from these unconsolidated deposits, but we can also produce it by crushing rocks and by crushing waste, such as construction and demolition waste, that by itself is a massive problem because it represents 35% of the total solid waste produced in the world. And it also allows us to identify some opportunities to increase the efficiency in the use of materials and to reduce the extraction of primary resources. That will be the goal. By using byproducts of other industries, functional substitutes such as timber, and also at the construction phase by making lighter buildings with less amount of concrete, and also designing for easy disassembly and reuse, which is now becoming more and more commonly accepted and adopted, and extending the lifetime of buildings and infrastructure. Then the second crucial dimension is the spatial representation of this network and assessing the impacts from the mining sites to the market, considering also spillover effects such as transportation costs and greenhouse gases emissions. And finally, a more sustainable use of sand resources hinges on people, on how people decide how much and which resources to use, because this is a system entirely driven by this network of agents and the decisions that they make. So they learn and adapt their behavior. They can prioritize certain deposits, or they can also respond to impacts by developing and enforcing regulations. So it's very important to know that this societal needs and decision-making process is what in the end shapes the landscapes that we see and the impacts that they have. And connected to this is the temporal dimension, because these systems evolve in time, in space, as complex adaptive systems in response to disruptions such as technological development, changing consumption patterns, or regulations. So building from studies in industrial ecology that has been developed for cement stocks, we will expect the growth in the stocks of construction sand and other materials for a given area to follow this logistic curve with different stages according to the speed and the acceleration of the stock growth. And along with these trajectories of these stocks, we will expect to see a sequence of configurations of sand supply networks and transition pathways to adapt to different supply bottlenecks that might emerge, with a possible reversal in the end towards a circular economy. And in general, leading to systems increasingly more complex. So let's see how these different stages or transition pathways look like. And we will start from a system with artisanal mining, with subsistence mining for local development projects. This is, for example, the case of the Usumacinta River in Mexico, which is one of the places where I do research. This is how mining in the river look like. So they take the boats and they go to the middle of the river where there are some different types of sand deposits, and they bring the sand barges to the shore, and they just use the engine of a motorbike to bring the sand from the shore to the higher part where they pile the sand. And it's an activity that has a very reduced footprint, and it's a system with plentiful of resources. So far, the studies that has been developed on the geomorphology show that there is no significant impact of mining activity. However, the situation might change significantly if there is an increase in the demand, and in particular, if there is an acceleration of the demand. Then we will expect this mining activity to expand to more numerous and to larger mining sites, commonly taking advantage of the most easily accessible deposits that are often rivers and coastal areas. And this is the perfect situation for finding supply bottlenecks and conflicts because of a variety of reasons: the overexploitation, perceived harms or conflicts between different land uses and land users, and also because of logistics and lagging licenses on insufficient production capacities. And this will force the system to reorganize in order to find ways to supply that material. One of the things that can happen, and it happens in several countries, is the emergence of illicit supply networks. In particular, in this case, we are referring, when we talk about illicit activity, we refer to the cases in which there is violence, threats, corruption methods, because it's also important to highlight that this activity is very informal in many places. But when we say informal, we refer to more of a socially accepted activity. When there is illicitness, there is a higher level of sophistication and threats on the communities. And this is, for example, what has happened in China in recent years. River sand has become an increasingly scarce resource, and this is having also, the amount of mining is having also significant environmental impacts, and the government is increasingly limiting the mining activity in rivers, increasing the price of sand leading to increases in the price of sand by 600%, which has triggered a lot of illicit activity in the rivers that the government is trying now to disrupt. Another pathway could be the intensification of the mining. This is something that we have seen in the Ganges River in Bangladesh. Here is very common, again, that the miners go to the different parts of the river, they load the barge in different parts of the river, they load the barges with sand, and then there are different storage areas on the side of the river. And we have seen that through time, and with an increasing demand through these years, these stockpiles have not only become bigger, but also more sophisticated. And the societal network behind also the management of these of these piles of sand is also becoming more complex. And in many cases, when the demand continues increasing, the initial reliance on these natural sands that are easily accessible and that might not be easily accessible anymore is easier to shift to crushed rock production, because although this requires more technology and capital investment, this way of production can deliver higher volumes and a wider range of products, allowing the industry to adapt to the changing demands of the markets. And this is one of the main reasons why this has already become the main source of aggregates in Europe, in North America, and recently, as you can see, in China as well. And also, with increasing restriction for mining sand in land areas and increasing amount of conflicts, the extraction is quite often moving more and more to the coastal areas, although this is already a mature sector. In Spain, this is not the case because, as you may know, it's completely banned to extract sand from coastal areas for construction purposes, but this is a sector that is growing in other parts of the world. And finally, and as we have seen with many other commodities, this might lead to the separation between production and consumption. And in particular, this production might be displaced to places with good transportation links and fewer constraints or fewer likeliness to have conflicts. And this is common for regions that have a high population density and limitations to exploit their own resources. This is the case of Singapore, but also you can see that the coast in the west coast of the US is increasingly becoming an importer of aggregates from the Vancouver Island of Canada. And this is not because they don't have sun, but it's because they have extracted a lot of sun, and this has led to very significant environmental problems, and now no one wants to open a quarry near people, so it's becoming increasingly difficult to get sun from local sources, so they are relying more and more on these imports. However, there are risks of spreading invasive species, of course, because there are many species that can be in the massive shipments of sun. And also it makes the sun way more expensive. Think that the sun has a very, very reduced cost. And then in the moment that we start increasing the transportation distance, the cost is gonna increase, the fuel, the time. So that's the reason why, even though the international trade is growing, it's still very reduced in many countries, and it represents less than 1% in the US or in China. So with this, looking at this evolution of sun supply networks, we have learned that this diversification of production provides opportunities for the reorganization of the system and make these networks more resilient to spikes in the demand or changing prices. However, this evolution doesn't necessarily lead to the greening of production, and we should always be very careful when assessing the impacts of the current and potentially alternative solutions to other supply streams of sun to try to prevent just the shifting of problems. And as we have seen with other natural resources like the fuel, as easily accessible deposits are exhausted, the extraction is displaced toward areas with more expensive deposits at greater distances from consumers and with increased extraction difficulty. And something that I want to highlight is that there is a very interesting report of the International Resource Panel that is kind of the EPCC of natural resources. And they have done a massive modeling exercise, and they saw that increasing material efficiency to reduce CO2 emissions from the mining and construction sector, and in particularly for reducing the amount of materials we need, is technically possible with the methods we have today. And it will create jobs, it will lead to economic growth. However, the most influential material efficiency strategies are not technical, but social. And so that meaning a more intensive use of buildings, reducing the material demand per person. And this makes the challenge quite significant, because this means that we need a societal transformation towards less material intensive lifestyles, and we are moving in the opposite direction with increasing urban sprawl and floor area per capita, which is expected to double by 2060. So I think this is one of the greatest challenges we have ahead. In order to increase and improve monitoring efforts and trying to get a better understanding of the problem, the United Nations, in particular the center in UNEP Geneva, has created a global sun observatory to which I contribute, and that is going to be in the next years leading efforts to increase the awareness and knowledge about this problematic. And I want to finish the presentation by highlighting another that I think is quite a cool research that is aiming to promote more transparency and traceability in these sun supply networks, with the idea that every sample of sun has a certain signature that allowing to connect it to the source areas, so that then we will be able to connect markets with sourcing areas, which might seem easy, but is very difficult in this industry. So we are developing what we call sun fingerprinting methods to try to develop technologies that can allow us disrupt these illicit supply networks in countries where this is an issue, contribute to the certification of sustainable sources, and also to monitoring and enforcement of regulations. So the hypothesis that we are testing here is that there is a set of signatures from this source that remain through the entire supply network to the consumer. And for this, we are applying provenance sediment analysis, that is a range of techniques that are very widely used for many decades in sedimentology, in archaeology, and in forensics as well. And I don't have time to explain a lot what we are finding, but so far the studies are working, the analyses have gone pretty well. We have identified in a proof of concept that we have developed in Texas in controlled conditions, age-supplied networks that exist and in which the compositional fingerprints we see that are preserved from the mining side to the processing and consumption, and with more variability between areas than within each of those areas. The problems of these sedimentology techniques is that they are relatively expensive, particularly if you think about the countries that might need these techniques more. Each sample can take from $50 to $1,000. So we are also developed an image analysis technique with machine learning that is called SunID, and we are developing an app with this tool. And the idea is that, and it's something that you notice when you start taking sample of sand from different places, that just by looking at them, you see the differences in colors and in different textures. And the idea emerged from that, and we have been taking pictures of different sand samples, and it looks like this technique is working pretty well, and in 86 to 91% of the cases, it can identify the source of sand correctly. So this is something that we are going to keep investigating now in less controlled locations, probably in Southeast Asia. And yeah, with this, I got to the end of my presentation. For the next years, you can find me in the University of Alicante when I started, where I started just last November. I just want to give a massive thanks to my many collaborators and also the people that has supported me during this time and allowed me to enjoy the process and that share my motivation. And I want to finish with a quote from John Wins from a conference when this line of research started for me. And he said that, after all, ecology is just about everything. So thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to questions.
Thanks, Aurora. So we have time for questions. Yeah, Carlos.
Thank you very much. It's very surprising for me. I never thought in these terms. It's very, very interesting. Thank you. And what about recycling? Is it possible to recycle? Because to what degree can recycle take place? And is it possible to get to a saturation point after which recycling should be enough? How do you see that?
So there is a lot of potential, but the potential also varies by different countries. So right now in Europe, the amount of recycling or the share of recycling is really high. The problem is that the sand that is recycled for construction and demolition projects usually goes to secondary uses like the infilling, and is not so much used for the production of materials such as concrete or mortar. So there is a lot of potential for increasingly using these materials. It's also very important to build the buildings for this easy disassembly of components, because if the different components in a building are very mixed, then it will take more effort and more energy to separate the material and the share of aggregates that we can use for construction. So, but it's something that has a lot of potential. I visited a factory in Mexico City, so it's something that we can use in many other countries, not only in Europe. And it was working very well in Mexico, and it was interesting that they also had like a training program where they go to the construction sites to teach the workers how they should distribute the different types of waste, so that then they will take them less amount of time to recycle the materials and that the system will be more efficient. The problem is that we continue increasing our material demand per capita. So it's not just enough with the resources that we have in the system. Right now, we still rely a lot in those natural sands. And yeah, I think, as I said before, this societal transformation and changing the idea that the progress is about having more of everything and bigger houses and bigger infrastructure, it's something that we need to change, and otherwise recycling is not enough, unfortunately.
If I can, one more.
Sure.
I'm a complete ignorant on this topic. So, is the certification good news for you, in the sense of becoming more land being?
I think in general, so it's at the infancy in this sector. If you compare it to any other sector or trade of any other commodities, it's something that is just started, the sustainable sourcing. It's also important to know that it's mainly for domestic trade, because the international trade, as I said, is not that large. So it's not that something like fair trade schemes are going to be really beneficial for this activity, because mainly we have to deal with this in our own countries. But in general, increasing the knowledge and the data that the companies, the mining companies and the construction companies can deliver, if the certification systems can help to that, I think it could be good news. And it's something that has potential for growth as well. There are many companies interested in that. But it will not be a panacea, of course.
More questions? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. It's been an amazing topic. My question is maybe a bit naive, but the pictures you use from sun places comes only from river or coastal ecosystems? But what about deserts? Like, is that the sun is not the desired composition for construction, or what happens with that?
That's a very good question, because it's kind of the obvious response. If there are many places that are running out of sun, let's go to the desert and get the sun from there. It's not that easy because of the characteristics of the desert sun. So what makes it in general unsuitable for use it in construction, for making concrete or mortar, is that the grains of sun, they have two problems. First of all, with the erosion of the wind, they are very round, muy pulidos, very soft. And also, when you make one of these mixes of concrete, you want a certain diversity of different sizes and shapes of grains. And the desert sand is very homogeneous. It's all grains of sand of the same shape, and then it's not ideal for making a mix for concrete. The concrete will not be strong enough, and it could fall. That said, there are many countries in places where they have deserts that are investigating ways to use that desert sand. In general, it requires more energy and it becomes more expensive. But yeah, there are many teams that are investigating that. There is even some teams that are investigating making pellets with the desert sand. So ground the sand, make the pellets, and build with those pellets. So people is becoming very creative. But in general, yeah, it's not ideal for construction. That's a problem.
I have a question for you, because it's still not clear to me what a more sustainable lifestyle in terms of thinking of urban sprawl would look like. You touched a bit on this, but...
Yeah, so in general, urban sprawl, I understand it by urban sprawl, buildings that are increasingly dispersed in the landscape and that require also more infrastructure to connect them. In general, they are more inefficient for the consumption of different natural resources. So more concentrated developments and taller buildings in general increase material efficiency and will be more desirable from the perspective of consuming these resources and make our consumption more efficient. But yeah, it's challenging because this is, as I said, this is kind of the opposite to what we are moving right now.
And are there example cities where the urban development is done with this sense sustainability in mind?
Well, I mean, urban sprawl is studied in many disciplines, and for many decades, people have been trying to think about ideas to contain this urban sprawl and move to more compact patterns. One of the studies that I know that was published last year was about green belts as a way to contain the urban development within those belts and avoiding the urban area jump before the green wall. the greenbelt. And there is a study that tested a comparison with 60 cities in Europe, 30 with greenbelts, another 30 without greenbelts. And it seems that it works, that the cities that had greenbelts were able to contain more the urban sprawl, and they kept growing in number of inhabitants, but that the development was more towards densification. So that's one of the things that could work.
Thanks. More questions? Also reminding those watching us on YouTube that they can use the chat for the questions. No? Waiting for YouTube? No. No question. Okay. Well, thanks again, Aurora. This was really interesting.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for participating. Thanks.
Thank you.